the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Here's my thought. Which one are you? And I want to say a lot of times I think we're more like Pharisees than we're willing to admit. But let's see. Look at verse 9, and he says, He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and looked down on everyone else. Two men went up to the temple complex to pray. One a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee took his stand and was praying like this: God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, greedy, unrighteous, adulterous, and even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give a tenth of everything I get. But the tax collector, standing afar off, wouldn't even raise his eyes to heaven, but kept striking his chest, saying, God, turn your wrath from me, a sinner. I tell you, this one went down to his house justified rather than the other, because everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbled himself will be exalted. Now, as I said, this is such a powerful story, and it should be also a sobering story, because whether we want to admit it tonight, I think many of us are like the Pharisees, where we do feel more superior. Look at the first line here, where he says, and this is it, he told this parable to some who trusted in themselves. And that right there, that line is very telling. Do you trust in yourself? Meaning this, do you trust in your own ability, your own righteousness, your own goodness? The Pharisees, notice, took his stand, a haughty stand. And he says, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people. And right off we see he's comparing himself by the wrong standard. He's looking at others. Now, the blindness there is his own hypocrisy. Keeps him from looking at his true self. But he compares himself to everybody else. He says, I'm not like other people. Look at this. I'm not like other people. I'm not greedy, unrighteous, or adulterous. And he says, and I'm not like this tax collector. Now, tax collectors were an easy target for the Pharisees. Tax collectors were the sinners of the day, the immoral, the loud, rambunctious people. You know, they did their sin openly. You saw what they're doing. You saw how they dress. They cursed and loud, right? You saw the debauchery. They were immoral. The Pharisees pretended they were holy. Notice he said, I'm not greedy. I'm not adulterer. I'm not like this. Actually, the very thing that he was praying, not only were they those things, but worse. Jesus often criticized and put the Pharisees on blast about their hypocrisy. Remember the story in John chapter 8 when Jesus said, when they brought the woman to Jesus, that it was caught in the very act, and they said, hey, Jesus, the law said, stone this woman. Jesus said, hey, those of you who are without sin, you cast the first stone. None of them could cast the first stone. You see, part of the problem with the Pharisees was their own inflated, they were in their own bubble. Many times we are the same way. We sit around in our own religious bubbles, in our own circles, and we compare ourselves by ourselves. We all dress the same way. We all have the same kind of haircut. We all go to the same church. We're in the same denominations. And we all pretend like, well, I don't sin like the other people. But be careful of that. This is when Jesus said here that if you exalt yourself, you're going to be humble. The other thing is that notice the Pharisees talked about, he listed some of the good works that he thought justified him. Now, before we go on, this word justify is very important, because the word justify is God's process of making us right, not our process. You see, our process, our method, our effort, we could never make ourselves right before God. We could never be good enough for God. Now, the tax collector couldn't even look up into heaven. He refused to look up to heaven. Seeing how unworthy he was, he just simply cried out for mercy. He just simply said, Lord, turn your wrath away from me, a sinner. And Jesus says, now that man went down to his house justified, meaning God made him righteous. You see, he recognized, I'm a sinner. I'm not looking at anybody else. I'm a sinner. And here's the thing. The Pharisees and the tax collectors were both sinners, except one went down justified and the other didn't. The reason why is because the one who went down, who wasn't justified, which is the haughty Pharisees, was because he trusted in his own works. And he looked at his own works. His problem, he didn't look at everything. He wasn't measuring himself according to God's standard. He wasn't looking at himself through God's light. He was looking at himself through his own self-righteousness, his own ability. And he failed to recognize, well, and this is where the humbleness comes in there, because he was too hardy to ask, God, what is your standard? In other words, all religious people are like this. And all religious people will say, God, here's what I'm handing you. By the way, Cain did that, and God rejected him. I want to say this. Let me exhort you. Be like the tax collector who recognized, who humbled himself before God and received God's mercy. And thus he received God's justification. And that's what we want. We ought to be asking ourselves, God, what is your method? Stop looking at man. Stop comparing yourself with man. And saying, God, what is your standard? Okay, guys, that's the morning word for today. See you next time.